naming names of the American philanthropic foundations with which people may be familiar, which ones are involved in this kind of funding? We hear a lot or read about recently now of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. What's the nature and extent of their involvement? And then are there any others?
Rockefeller Brothers, and particularly Stephen Hines, who is the executive director of chair of Rockefeller Brothers Fund. And there are different Rockefeller Brothers or Rockefeller foundations. Yeah, they're very much involved, very much, I'd say, responsible or irresponsible as enablers, particularly what we're seeing on U.S. campuses today. There's these pseudo-Jewish organizations that provide a fig leaf claiming to be Jewish, like Jewish Voice for Peace, got their core funding from Rockefeller Brothers under the framework of promoting peace. And one of the aspects of that was driving a wedge between the Jewish community and Israel. This is Mr. Stephen Hines, who used to be, by the way, a staff member for the former vice presidential candidate, what's his name? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that gives you a sense of the irresponsibility of where he is now. Other organizations that are like that, something called If Not Now. These are all fringe groups that claim to be Jewish, get a lot of PR, but mostly they're fig leaves for some of the most vicious, violent, anti-Semitic groups like Students for Justice for Peace and other frameworks like that. So Rockefeller Brothers are in deep, and there are other groups like that as well that they funded. And by the way, people who want more details can look at NGO Monitor's website and look up Rockefeller Brothers. But I'd say that we'd be remiss in not talking about other groups, other funders as well. George Soros, the Open Society, I think it's Institute or Foundation. In terms of numbers, the amounts, they dwarf what Rockefeller Brothers does. I'll give you one cogent example, but there are dozens more. In 2009, the founder of Human Rights Watch, a gentleman by the name of Robert Bernstein, published an op-ed in the New York Times condemning the organization he founded. He had retired. He was no longer involved. He provided some funding. And he gets into the New York Times. I had many conversations with Bob about this. It was very hard for him to do. Condemning Human Rights Watch, led by Ken Roth, for turning Israel into a pariah state. That was in 2009. Now, the volume of demonization has expanded greatly. Okay, all in 2009, 2010, the main funders of Human Rights Watch pulled out. They wanted to replace Ken Roth. Board members resigned. Then in steps George Soros with a check for $100 million. All of a sudden, Human Rights Watch isn't just in trouble. It's become a superpower. And then if Soros gives, so many other people follow, and organizations and foundations follow. So certainly, and we hope that Alex Soros, his son, will take a good look at what that money did and how much anti-Semitism and violence and hatred that engendered and enabled. So those are the two. Ford Foundation is in and out. Lately, they've been back in. Unfortunately, back in those days of 2000, 2001, 2002, they funded a lot of the NGOs that were part of the political war back when Israelis were being blown up in buses. It's very similar to now in terms of the political war, soft power war accompanying the terrible attacks that kill so many Israelis.
Mm-hmm. If you were a person of means, financial means in America, and either had a foundation or maybe you're a person not of means and work at a foundation, where would you look for groups to fund that engage in what I called anyway traditional notions of charity? Are there any? If you want to help people who are suffering in the Middle East, where would one look?
It's very, very difficult. The phrase bad money chases out whatever it is, good money. Well, it's the same thing with NGOs. These organizations suck up huge amounts of money. Now, I'm hesitant about being a Michelin guide, but from what we can tell, there are a couple of organizations, one in particular, and I'm not giving advertising, I know, and I don't even know, I haven't looked at them, and they may not be in this category anymore, but Human Rights First, which is a much smaller, less visible organization. Most people haven't heard of them. Their budget is maybe a 20th last time I checked of Human Rights Watch. And they do criticize Israel. They criticize everybody, but not with the obsessive, pathological, disproportionate, all those terms that we've documented time after time of Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International. So there are organizations, but it requires looking. So foundations that want to do good work, there are some of those. That's a place to go, and let's check them out.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned how in Europe, some of the governments are thinking it might be a good time to sort of get out of this business of paying for of funding what's going on in the NGO world there. How about in America, if you're a policymaker who's looking at what's being called charity and thinking maybe it isn't, with calls for violence and actual violence near where you live? What is it that a policymaker in America could consider to be responsive to what's going on here?
First of all, the United States, in many ways, this is a trivial statement, but on this particular issue, also is exceptional and different than Europe. Now, there are, in democratic administrations, and I'll give you some examples, occasionally efforts to line up with Europe. The Canadians are 100% in as Europeans in this area, which means don't look at what we're giving the money to. We don't care. We're just throwing it out there because it makes us look good. We want to get our pictures taken, helps us with some of our voters, all that stuff. The United States government, State Department in particular, USAID within the State Department, generally does not give to NGOs or is very careful. They build projects, they control, they examine, they do oversight, and the amount of leakage into terrorism is not 50 or 100%, it's much smaller. And I'll give you a couple of caveats on that, but that's the general trend. There had been efforts periodically, both in the Obama administration and go back to Clinton, Obama, I'm old, I know all this stuff. So, and now under Biden, and there are a couple of things that slip through the net. And you got all these State Department and lobbyists who come in and they want to sell we're doing great stuff, we're going to promote peace. They're very careful when they do that about vetting. There's the Anita Lowy Fund, which I think was something like 250 million. I don't know how much that's been distributed, but they're vetting that, which is supposed to promote Palestinian-Israeli cooperation. There are 2 or 3 exceptions I think they're important to recognize, especially now. This is NGO Monitor's work, right? We look at all of these grants. Something called the Phoenix Foundation or Center in Gaza got some money for promoting democracy among Palestinians. There was some House hearings, House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee hearings recently, where this was discussed. This was our research. And I want to say that a number of witnesses, Elliot Abrams in particular, former high-level State Department official and now at the Council on Foreign Relations, specifically asked the questions, and the officials from the administration were tongue-tied. And that was good. How did this get through the net? Did you do the homework? Because the Phoenix Center, they're clear footprints of terror-linked organizations. And if you operate in Gaza and you don't look for those, you're not doing your job. You're not doing oversight, due diligence, and that's a serious matter. Occasionally also, USAID money going to some grantees will then be subcontracted. And there is also, there's a big hole.
Yeah.
They don't, the grants, the requirements for vetting subcontractors are loose to non-existent, and stuff gets through, and it shouldn't be. So those are the things that we focus on. I'll just add one other half sentence on that. This is not NGO issues, but the US government is the largest single donor to the United Nations Refugee or Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. And that money paid for those, not just the US, the European Union and Germany are the other 2 biggest ones, Everybody wants to give to these. The UNRWA should not exist. There should not be a separate UN agency for funding Palestinian refugees from 1948. It's entirely political. And so much of that aid we know goes into producing the whole terrorist industry that is primarily what happens in Gaza.
And how about American private philanthropy, which is governmentally tax incentivized?
Well, that's what we talked about when we talked about the Soros Foundation or Hope Society.
Could a
Rockefeller.
policymaker?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be tax incentivized. Anything you think might be.
Well, that's the question.
Yeah.
When does it? And I think that needs to be looked at in more detail. There's always a difficult line, but maybe now it's not so blurry, between political advocacy and material support for terrorism or various other types of incitement to violence. And I think that needs to be looked at carefully, particularly in the case of the donors to Human Rights Watch. I think that's the most blatant example of a US-based 501c3. Perhaps also the Amnesty USA needs to be more carefully examined, and that's a separate history, but it's not nearly as large. The major amnesty base is London, and their charity commission has got to get more into the process.
Great. Well, why don't I stop taking up your time, Professor Steinberg, but let me thank you for it. And we very much appreciate your doing this with us.
Michael, it's my pleasure, and you asked good questions, and I hope I gave some good answers.
Okay, thanks.